Hi, this is your host Sapna Bhartiam for Arlington, Virginia, and welcome to TFiR Security, a show where we talk about cloud native security. And today we have with us once again Ron Nixon, Vice President at Polyverse. Ron, this show is more or less like reflecting on security last week because there are so many topics we are going to cover. We are going to talk about the Senate's hearing of whole SolarWinds and Microsoft Exchange, and then we are going to talk about some directives that are coming from White House related to zero trust. So before we start, which topic would you pick to start this discussion with?
I think if we were going to start with something, maybe we start a little bit with the Senate hearings because that really does kind of tie everything together. I have to give the Senate a little bit of credit. So they moved a lot faster than what people expect. So the series of attacks happened, late last year into January, and the Senate's already held a hearing on it. And so they brought in Microsoft FireEye representatives from Microsoft FireEye, CrowdStrike, and SolarWinds to have a discussion about why the SolarWinds attack happened, what could be done to prevent it in the future. And it was kind of interesting because you saw the different degrees of technical understanding within the Senate, which is always something that's kind of interesting to see. But you also saw the different aspects between a completely traditional cybersecurity, not a traditional cybersecurity, but a company like CrowdStrike, who's completely centered around cybersecurity as a product. And then you had Mandiant, which is, yes, they do threat intelligence and analysis. They do incident handling and responding, and they do security products. And then you have Microsoft, which is we provide service and we provide security. And then SolarWinds, which of course is a network management company, for lack of a better term. But so you had very different viewpoints on that. And then you also saw, where the Senate, and they asked some really good questions about how they could actually begin to help with a problem like this. So it was definitely an interesting engagement.
One thing that I may be wrong, you can correct me. When I compare these breaches in US versus they happen in the European Union, there is a big contrast, number one. And you're absolutely right that companies may choose to report or not report. Also, there are no penalty. Like we keep hearing about data breaches, and some are very serious. Credit card breaches. Airlines. I just got from United Airlines a few days ago. These keep happening, but there is no penalty there is no fines. So in Europe, I remember when I set up my services, and one of the companies, they were not even allowed to collect my credit card information. They they said, yes, it is a bit of unnecessary work, but you cannot steal the information that I don't have. So since we do not store any credit card information by law, you cannot even steal from here. So they're much more strict in European Union versus here. So when it does come to framework, because we are talking about policy making from perspective, number one is that the requirement to, first of all, disclose, and then there should be penalty that if there's a company which is infamous, like I don't want to name once again, there are companies every 6 months you hear that, hey, in this year, 3 years ago, some data was compromised, and then you will hear 6 months later data. So some action should be there that those companies should not even be. So I do see that from the policy point of view, we lack all those measures that are needed to protect the very, very sensitive data.
And you're spot on, right? Because it's just like having a speed limit, right? So if I'm going 75 and a 55, but I never get a ticket for it, then I am always going to drive 75 and a 55. And so if there are no repercussions, then there's no financial, application that forces a company to make a change. And that's really what it comes down to. Love it or hate it, cyber insurance is one of those things that has begun to mitigate that a little bit, right? Because they can take a company that has cyber insurance can offload possibly some of their lawsuits to that insurance policy and things like that. And so it makes it even harder to hold somebody accountable. And so I do envy, in some ways, I very much agree with the way the EU has taken a stance on protecting personal information and holding companies accountable. I think there's maybe a balance between what the United States does, which is next to nothing, and then that. Especially if you start looking at some of the breaches. The Star Alliance, right? They're in the news today for and what's that? That's a dozen airlines. I know I'm one of them, right? Where all of that information is just out there in the wind now. My information was part of the OPM brief more than a few years ago now, right? There were 4 million government employees, and the only repercussions to OPM, the Office of Personnel Management, was they got to pay for, my LifeLock account for a couple of years, and that's not over time. I mean, banks don't have that, right? The SEC will shut a bank down. You have them pursuing the people who drove up GameStop pricing, but yet nobody's going to hold, pick a company that's been hacked in the last year or 2 years, accountable. And then you start thinking about things like medical organizations with HIPAA data and things like that, and there's just no real repercussions to them. You're right. And something does have to be done. And I'm hoping that SolarWinds and even the White House is starting to talk about executive orders around cybersecurity. I'm hoping that begins to congeal around not just funding and information sharing and processes, but also accountability.
NSA released guidance on zero trust security model.
So the NSA recently released their documentation and guidance around zero trust, and it's very much founded and grounded in what NIST has already released. And so the one thing that it does begin to do is it adds a degree of authority. Is really the important part to it. So when the NSA releases information, especially around security guidance, it becomes, so psychologically, it becomes in that best practice bracket of these are the things that you should be doing within the security, where if NIST is releasing it, it may be taken as guidance, but it's not necessarily guidance that holds you accountable. But then when you have the NSA turning around and backing what they're saying, it adds it again. And so my issue, I guess, though, when I think about zero trust and the policy, so it is very much grounded in identity and access management, identity and access control to your environment, right? So it's about making sure that the right people have the right access to the right information, and all the technologies are still somewhat network centric. They're beginning to get into the applications and data sets, but it doesn't necessarily go the opposite direction into the hardware environment or your software or how your software is being developed. But it does anchor itself, and it gives some authority to what NIST has already published.
The third topic for today's discussion is that Microsoft Exchange hack. So let's talk about how severe it is, the impact, and what is the remediation going on there.
Okay, so it is significant, to say the least. So it basically affects versions of Microsoft Exchange, I think from 2013 into the current version, and it does pretty much give you free access to, not free access, but it pretty much gives you access to everything that's on the Exchange server, to include emails, user accounts, and all of that type of information. And the problem you have is of I think right now the current count is somewhere in the ballpark of about 30,000 organizations have been breached. And so basically anybody who is running, so you think about it today, everybody's doing remote work for the most part. And it's basically anybody who is running OWA, so online web access for Microsoft Exchange, and is running their own Exchange server. So it's really going to be devastating. And what you're seeing is lots of small businesses, a lot of small municipalities, counties, city governments. And there's two things that make this really dangerous. One is they don't have the incident handlers and responders and technical staff a lot of times to be able to actually respond to something like this. And the other piece is they not only that, they don't necessarily always have the funding to create that. So now what Microsoft has done is Microsoft is in the process of providing patches. They've already published some indicators of compromise, so you can begin to look to see where it's at. The actual web files or the actual the compromised files are all over the place. Even Chris Krebs, the former director of CISA, it posted it in his Twitter feed, like, hey, if you see this, go look for it and consider yourself compromised. And so it's really going to be devastating, because it happens to small organizations that don't necessarily have the money to recover and don't necessarily have the technical staff to recover. And that's what really makes this devastating. And you will also see it as a push for lots of companies to say, well, if you were already completely in the cloud, you wouldn't have had this problem because Office 365 wasn't impacted. So you're going to see a lot of the migration companies, be honest, in my opinion, be a little bit greedy about it and capitalize on it and push people towards the cloud. But you're also going to see a lot of smaller organizations screaming for help because they're not tooled to be able to deal with this.
Yes, the SaaS will be seen as an ultimate, but then one of the things with SaaS is that services, when they go down, there's a downtime. Everybody suffers, So it has a mix. When we talked about SolarWinds, when we talk about zero trust and all the directives that are coming in, oftentimes what we are talking, unless in this SaaS, even in the case of SaaS, if you are doing a lot of things on-prem, it seems like a supply chain problem because, the components where they're coming from, where they're going from. So what I want to talk about is that we have talked about the problem areas. When we talk to Polyverse, the thing is that you stop attacks before they happen. So let's talk about some very, very progressive or forward-looking, concept, or even in reality, founded and grounded in reality, what can be done to mitigate some of this, because we do know our senators will not be well equipped to know all that goes on in the tech field. So let's talk about the things that can be done to protect.
So on one hand, so if you're gonna take that towards from a technology standpoint, so I would first highlight a process standpoint. So SolarWinds was able to run the gambit the way it did because of poor configuration management control, right? Yes, trusted application, trusted update to a trusted application, but they were able to capitalize on that based on, poor password management and things like that. And so they were able to run rampant because of other things that weren't properly done. So I don't like the term cyber hygiene, but it is the term cyber hygiene, right? The other piece to that is, especially when you start talking about supply chain, when you start talking about supply chain integrity for your software, what are you doing within that space? How are you verifying that your code is good, known good code? And some of that comes with running your scans like Fortify and things like that. From Polyverse, we take it a step further. And so the reason we're able to stop attacks before they start is because we change your code at the binary level, which makes it basically nearly impossible for a bad guy to write an exploit to take advantage of what you do. Well, if you take that same type of technology and if you take our processes and apply it towards your code supply chain, it actually gives you the ability to verify and ensure that you have verified code from the source. And then we allow you to wrap your application and your operating system together as part of that management process. And that's not normally done. Normally, when you're thinking about DevSecOps, it's really application focused and you're not wrapping the operating system into it. So we allow you to package all of it together, secure it, and then always come back to the same point to pull your software from again. And so you're shortchanging that supply chain and you're making it much more difficult for the bad guys to inject something into that supply chain, nearly impossible, 1 in 8 quadrillion chance of being able to exploit it. So those are pretty good odds in your favor.
Ron, thank you so much for unwrapping all these topics for this discussion. And I look forward to talk to you again. Thank you.
Same here. You have a good day.